because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We have a lot to talk about, as you might imagine. And one of the challenges, which I'll mention even in the next hour, is when you talk about the lead story, which is obviously the issue of impeachment inquiry. You sometimes, if you focus all your time and attention on that, ignore some other very important stories. And so, given the fact that I do have an hour before we have Max Lucado joining us at 1 o'clock, I'm going to have a chance to go through some of that with you, because there are some very important stories that we will be talking about. And by the way, I kind of tipped my hand. That is, Max Lucado will be with us next hour. His book is How Happiness Happens, and it is a fascinating book on all the one another verses in the scriptures. And I had a chance to hear him actually speak on that topic at Prestonwood Baptist Church, which actually was just chapter 10 of the book. I mentioned to my wife that the entire sermon that he gave was based on just one chapter in the book, which I think, if nothing else, underscores that even when I do a fairly thorough book interview, and many of the authors are impressed that I actually read the book, I know that's a concept, and actually try to go through some of that material, even so, he was able to do an entire sermon just on one of the 11 chapters in the book. So that tells you how much is actually packed into the book, which we'll be talking about at 1 o'clock. And then he will be leaving early enough, so we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about the issue of impeachment. And, of course, it's Climate Week at the United Nations, so we have to talk about some of those issues. And then Mat Staver will be with us at 2 o'clock today. That will be the third hour, and you may be listening on a radio station that does not carry that, but you can certainly listen online. Go to Facebook Live, go to pointofview.net, or even if you have the app on your phone, listen to that as well. And we're going to talk about some of these laws restricting same-sex therapy or homosexual therapy. And so we'll get into that for a little while and then get back to some of those very important issues. We have posted some articles, one on the Associated Press in which the House Speaker ordered impeachment proceedings. We have one on a timeline that I'm going to take you through a little bit later, and then just an idea of how there has been a call for the transcript, and as soon as the president said he was going to make available the transcript, oh, well, then that's a bad idea to release the transcript, and you can't win one way or the other. But given the fact that it is Wednesday and that the transcript has been released, we now know what is in it. And so I want to start with that. As you may know, we've talked about this at least once on Monday. The fact is that President Donald Trump was talking to his Ukrainian counterpart, the president, Volodymyr Zelensky, to look into Joe Biden and to investigate that. Also said he would ask the Attorney General, which we now find out he never did ask the Attorney General, but it was saying he would. And this, of course, is a July 25th phone call, which maybe they decided not to do. But nevertheless, you read the transcript and you begin to realize the first principle I want to put on the table. Everything just about that has been said about this July 25th phone call turned out not to be quite accurate. First of all, the whistleblower is an individual that actually did not hear the actual conversation. So in some respects, you can say those of us now that have the transcript know more about the conversation than the whistleblower. So now that they want to bring the whistleblower to the House, wait a minute, we have the transcript. We don't have to depend on your secondhand retelling of what was said, because we actually have the transcript, unless somebody has some question about whether the transcript is accurate. That would be a real mistake on the part of the Trump administration. So that's point number one. Point number two is the press also said that President Trump mentioned Joe Biden 8 times. He did not. Here's actually from the transcript what was said. As President Donald Trump is talking with Zelensky, President Zelensky says there's a lot of talk about Biden's son. That would be Hunter Biden. And I'm going to give you a timeline in just a minute to help you understand what we're talking about here. But there's been a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Then he also goes on to say Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution so you can look into it. It sounds horrible to me. So Biden's mentioned once. Actually, his name shows up twice, however you want to count it, but it's not 8 times. It's sort of an offhanded comment in the midst of a lot of other conversation. And if that is the justification for impeachment proceedings, it's what many people call thin gruel indeed. But what I want to try to do is do something that the mainstream press has never done, and that is give you a timeline. Because, again, this was a conversation on July 25th, and the argument is that there was a quid pro quo. In other words, if you do this, then I will release $391 million in military aid. Let's answer 3 very important questions before we take a break. First of all, what came first? Trump's phone call came first with Zelensky, and the decision to withhold that $391 million actually came even before that. So if you look at the July 25th call, this happened before, and so that leads to the second obvious question. Okay, what came first? That is, what was the motivation to initially withhold the military aid? And the answer to that is, according to the White House, the primary concern was corruption within the Ukrainian government. And so there were a number of people that were concerned about this. Now, if you dig a little bit, and I encourage you to look at it yourself, because, you don't have to trust what I have to say. You can read it for yourself. You can go to the Washington Examiner, and they actually reported that the Trump administration back then said they wanted time to determine whether this newly elected president, Zelensky, was pro-West or pro-Russia. Well, pretty good in question, I mean, are you going to side with Putin, or are you going to side with us in NATO? And so in case you have any question about whether or not Donald Trump is honest, and I've heard people make that before, most people tend to think that some of the most honest people in the administration would certainly be people like, Vice President Mike Pence. Well, Mike Pence on September 2nd actually met with President Zelensky, and after that particular meeting said, quote, I'm giving you a quote now, as President Trump has made clear, we have great concern about the issues of corruption, but then, of course, said that that was no longer a concern, which leads to the third issue. When were the funds released, and what were the circumstances of that? Those funds were released about 10 days later on September 12th. Guess who led the charge to release the funds? Well, that would be the Democratic leader in the United States Senate, Dick Durbin, and actually threatened legislation to force Donald Trump to release the aid if he did not. And on the other side, you had in Congress Representative John Kennedy from Louisiana, who was also on board with Dick Durbin, in which he said, quote, we support Ukraine, period, end of discussion. While that effort was bipartisan, if anything, it was actually led by the Democrats. Those would be the same Democrats now that, of course, want to impeach Donald Trump over this particular action. So when we come back and talk about what that means, first of all, again, I want to take you into why was this a concern? One of the people we've had on this program is Peter Schweitzer. 7 essential facts over the Biden-Ukraine dealings. And then what about this issue of impeachment? We'll cover all of that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The recent drone attack on the Saudi Arabian oil processing plant raises lots of questions that our leaders will need to answer quickly. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declared that it was an act of war by Iran, but confirming the link and deciding how to respond are just a few of the questions that need to be answered. The drone attack temporarily cut off an estimated 5% of the world's oil supply. President Trump authorized the release of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve if needed. It may not be needed since the U.S. is much closer to energy independence than it was in the past. Those of us who are older remember the oil shocks of the past. One of my co-hosts, who was born in the 1980s, only read about what it was like in the 1970s with the oil embargo and gas lines that sometimes spread for a mile. A few economists and government officials estimated that the U.S. and a few others could absorb the loss of Saudi oil production, how different it is today compared to a few decades ago. The drone attack on the oil plant also illustrated what could happen in this country to our energy grid or oil production facilities. The president did issue an executive order last March requiring federal agencies to assess and fix vulnerabilities of our electric grid. It might collapse by design through a foreign adversary like Iran or by accident through naturally occurring phenomenon. Frank Gaffney of the Center for Security Policy laments that some bureaucrats in the deep state don't seem very serious about studying and fixing the vulnerabilities of the U.S. energy grid. One bureaucrat in Homeland Security argued that the risk of electromagnetic pulses taking down the electric grid is overestimated. Frank Gaffney has a ready response. Want to bet? Think Saudi Arabia. The drone attack should be a wake-up call to get moving on protecting our energy grid. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's ask one very important question. When is a transcript not a transcript? And Andrew brought this up just a minute ago, so Andrew, thank you for that. I have been calling it a transcript. A lot of people in the media have been calling it a transcript. Others are saying, no, it's just a recollection. And from what I understand, and we got Gary Bauer on Friday, so when we do bring him in on Friday, I do want to ask him a little bit more about this. But what I understand, having never been in the West Wing like Gary Bauer has, but what I understand is when the president makes a phone call to a leader, there are people that are gathered in the Situation Room, and all of them pretty much are typing simultaneously. Then after the phone call, they put together, they see if somebody missed one piece or whatever, and that is then kind of, if you will, a transcript, or you can call it a recollection of actually the phone call. So apparently there are some people, as they're always want to do, saying this is not a transcript, it's just a recollection. Well, it's the best record we have of a conversation that took place. Now, people say, well, why can't we get the tape? Well, apparently they don't tape it, and that probably is a good idea, because in just a few minutes, I'm going to talk about all the problems with what the president has done, because it isn't just the fact that he actually encouraged Zelensky to check into this. It is the fact that now releasing the transcript or the recollection, I'm going to just still call it a transcript if you allow me to do that, creates all sorts of problems. As we talked about on Monday, then you have a situation where John F. Kennedy was using back channels to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was because he wasn't sure there wouldn't be leaks in that situation. And Richard Nixon opened the door to China, and that was through Henry Kissinger, and did this again through back channels because they just can't trust anybody. And this administration, because there are people in the deep state, there are people left over from the Obama administration and even really from the Bush administration that don't like Donald Trump, they're doing all they can to make his life more difficult. And so it's not surprising that oftentimes this president wants to meet face-to-face with these leaders, and he wants to do it in a way there's no open mic. And, of course, even Barack Obama found himself in a situation with an open mic where he was making some comments that were to be taken back to Putin, to Medvedev, and that, of course, has been there ever since. So that is, again, one of the great challenges I'll come back to in just a minute. But I tried to answer the questions. You know, I recognize that the chances that this president will be impeached are very, very high. The other day, Newt Gingrich made the comment that he thinks that the impeachment will happen. And the reason is because of momentum. I'll give you the count here, but I think the last count was 204. I'll look this up in just a minute. Of those Democrats who said they are willing to vote for impeachment. Well, that gets you pretty close to the 218. Yes, 204 House Democrats. So, first of all, there is momentum. You might remember from your physics, momentum. If an object is in motion, it will continue in motion. By the way, if an object or a car or a ball is rolling down a hill, it tends to pick up speed. I think there is every reason to believe that there will be a vote on impeachment of the president and that may indeed take place. Now, that does not mean that Donald Trump will be removed from office. We went through this back with Bill Clinton. He'll be impeached in the House. He will not be convicted in the Senate any more than Bill Clinton was. But nevertheless, that's kind of my prediction. I think that's at least a possibility. It's also possible that, as we'll talk about in just a minute, Nancy Pelosi will figure out some way to put the brakes on it, but we will see. But let's back to a couple of questions. First of all, I wanted to answer the question that is not being talked about in the press, the timeline. What came first, the questions about the military aid or the July 25th phone call? We answered that. Why was there even a concern about the military aid? Because they did not know if Zelensky was going to be pro-West or pro-Russia. And there was also concerns about a fair amount of corruption in Ukraine, you think? And then finally, when the funds were released, they were released after the meeting with the Vice President, Mike Pence, on September 2nd, less than 10 days later, pushed forward by Dick Durbin, who's a Democrat, in order to, and again, that's a question I have. Why was he pushing for that so much? And maybe there's something else we'll find out about that in the future. But I thought it would be helpful to backtrack a little bit. Why is it that there even is this idea of a need for an investigation of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden? And so this comes from Peter Schweitzer, who's been on the program with us before. Maybe we should get him back on again. Really, you can read it. It's because it's all well documented in his book, Secret Empires, How the American Political Class Hides Corruption and Enriches Families and Friends. In the past, he's talked about some of the corruption in Congress, and there was quite a bit of this. The more recent book that just came out a year ago documents what we'll now be talking about. And there's a nice summary that he created just the other day of 7 points. Actually, 6 relate to Ukraine, 1 to China. I'll just read them just so that you know, why would Donald Trump bring this up in the first place? Okay, point number 1, Joe Biden's son, whose name is Hunter Biden, joined the board of the Ukrainian energy company Burisma in April of 2014. And that is according to bank records. Nobody challenges that. At the time, Hunter Biden had no background that I can see in terms of energy, and yet he joined an energy company. Then over the next 16 months period, they paid $3 million to a bank account associated with Hunter Biden. So there you go. So if you want to talk about quid pro quo, there's one. He joins the board, and then $3 million end up in his banking account. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is Joe Biden, as vice president, led the Obama administration's policy towards Ukraine when he served as vice president. And, of course, as he was very much interested because his son was now involved, he also helped shape Ukraine's energy and anti-corruption policies, and that led directly to helping this energy company, Burisma. Number 3, Burisma sought to capitalize Hunter Biden's name and relationship. Now this comes from the New York Times, and the New York Times reported that Hunter Biden helped assemble the company's legal team, assisted with American attorneys and consulting firms, including a former Obama Justice Department official. Number 4, this energy company, Burisma, was led by an oligarch, Mykola Zoltchev, who actually was the ecology minister under a pro-Russian former Ukrainian leader, leading to at least some allegations that he used his office to benefit this energy company that Hunter Biden sat on as well. Number 5, then as they were under all sorts of legal scrutiny because of some of the questions of corruption, shortly before Hunter Biden was appointed to the board, British authorities actually froze $23 million of those assets as part of their corruption investigation. And that's where then Ukraine opened its own investigation of corruption taking place in this energy company that Hunter Biden was on. Then you can go to number 6. Financial records from Morgan Stanley show all sorts of lines of money going into the account of a Robert H. Biden. And the funds originated from oligarchs and various anonymous sources in Ukraine, China, Kazakhstan, and elsewhere. And so then that's when you actually have even the claim, which I read just a minute ago, that was repeated by President Donald Trump, that Joe Biden actually told him to knock it off, otherwise there would be consequences. And so all of a sudden the investigation went away. And then 7, this also helps you understand that it wasn't just in Ukraine, because number 7, in 2013, when then Vice President Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden flew aboard Air Force Two to China, 10 days later, Hunter Biden's firm was able to receive a deal of $1.5 billion with a subsidiary of the Chinese government's Bank of China. Now, those are just some of the key points from an entire book, which you can go to Barnes & Noble or Amazon and buy, called Secret Empires, How the American Political Class Hides Corruption and Enriches Family and Friends. And Peter Schweitzer has been an individual that has investigated both Republicans and Democrats, pointed out some of the Republican speakers of the House and even the current Democrat Speaker of the House, some of the sweetheart deals they've been able to pull together. He certainly investigated some of the things that have happened under the Clintons, under the Bidens and Obamas, and it's all in that book. And that's one of the reasons, probably the principal reason, why President Donald Trump asked them to look into that. Was that a good idea? After the break, I'm going to talk about how it really doesn't make a great deal of sense. And if you think about it for a minute, if there really was that much corruption, wouldn't you think that the incoming president would have already done the investigation if there was something there? So it probably wasn't the smartest thing for the president to even bring it up. And, of course, now that's supposedly going to lead to his impeachment. We'll talk more about that right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Do you think impeachment is imminent, and do you think that this is appropriate, or is it just a lot of conversation about nothing? I'd love to get your comments, 1-800-351-1212. I'll say just a couple of things real quickly on impeachment and move on to other topics, because there are other things that you really need to know about. But one of those issues is how these dominoes fall. Jim Garrity put it this way: the dominoes of impeachment start to topple in sequence, because you have Nancy Pelosi announcing that the House of Representatives is moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry. And I love what he says. The last word in that sentence matters on paper. Nothing really has changed. Think about this. You have the House Judiciary Committee, and that would be Representative Jared Nadler, who has already started an impeachment inquiry. So there is going to be an attempt, I would predict, of the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, to try to have some conversation about impeachment, but not actually have a vote on impeachment. And there's a very good reason for that. The most recent poll asked Americans, do you favor impeachment of the president? And that percentage was at 35%. Now, we also recognize, and I've heard many individuals that are leaders in the Democrat Party that I've seen interviewed on various talking head shows, say that this is a lesson that they learned from the impeachment proceedings with Bill Clinton. The particular party calling for impeachment usually does poorly in the next election. And even last night, I saw on Sean Hannity, he, on two separate occasions, posted this ongoing scrolling list of those members of the House of Representatives who are Democrats, who actually live in and represent congressional districts that were actually won by Donald Trump. And those individuals are extremely vulnerable, as are quite a number of those other individuals. So what I wanted to do, and maybe in the next hour I'll just talk about impeachment, but if you found it slightly confusing or even boring this last half hour, I want to at least put it on the record so that if somebody says, well, what's going on, you would have access to it. But now the real question is that you have to come back to one of the points that could be made, because if indeed Hunter Biden or the energy company was involved in something that could be indicted, don't you think that the prosecutors in Ukraine or the incoming president would have moved on that? Think about that for just a minute. If you wanted to, in a sense, ingratiate yourself with the president of the United States, actually doing an investigation of the son of one of the individuals that would actually run against you, perhaps in the presidential election, that and one of your potential rivals, that would be the case. And the fact is that the Ukrainian legal team did not move on that. And so even though Donald Trump asked them to investigate, I don't know where that takes us. But in the same article, it does indeed show that the vote is getting close. There are, according to the New York Times, 204 House Democrats that support impeachment. In case you're wondering, you only need 218. Doesn't take any amount of imagination to figure out where Nancy Pelosi could come up with the other 14. As a matter of fact, I think it's going to be really difficult for any Democrat to vote against it if that vote is coming forward, because after all, there are those who are in the left wing of the Democrat Party that have wanted this for some time. You have Tom Steyer, who's actually a presidential candidate, who's made that really the centerpiece of what he wants to do. And again, I think Jim Garrity says, do the Democrats think impeachment polls badly because the American people think Trump is an all-around good guy with a sterling character? Or is it because the American people know that they'll have the only chance to render a judgment on Trump in November 2020, and they don't want lawmakers attempting to interrupt their choice and make it for them? So this is the real challenge right now. Will there be enough momentum to actually force Nancy Pelosi, against her better judgment, to actually have an impeachment vote? It's one thing to have an impeachment inquiry, but it's another thing to have that vote. And if indeed that vote comes down, I don't see how she does not get the requisite 218 plus votes necessary for impeachment. We'll see where it goes, and that's why we'll be talking about it every single day. One last point before I move on to some other topics. It was interesting, in one of the articles I've posted here reminds us that for a couple of days there were people saying, we want to see the transcript, we want to see the transcript. And, of course, first of all, when Donald Trump announced that he was going to make the transcript available, the fact is it showed at the time there probably wasn't anything that was too much of a smoking gun. And, of course, now we have a chance to read it so we don't have to speculate about it. But it did result in something which I thought was interesting, and that is the moment even that they were talking about releasing the transcript or the recollection, whatever you want to call this thing, Michael McFaul and others in the Democratic Party said, quote, and this is just reading from his Twitter piece, "This is a big mistake, terrible precedent, as no foreign leaders in the future will speak candidly with the president on any future calls. Don't release Trump-Zelensky or Trump-Putin transcripts of calls. Instead, release the whistleblower's complaint to Congress as required by law." Well, that didn't happen. And back to the point I made just a few minutes ago, we don't have to now even listen to this whistleblower, whoever he or she is, because, first of all, this was a secondhand recollection. It was now, according to the IG, an individual that already has a preference or a bias towards one of the Democrat presidential candidates, and frankly is not a true whistleblower complaint anyway. Now, any one of us that read the transcript know more than the person that was the whistleblower. So we'll see whether or not they bring about some kind of show trial for that, but we'll see where it goes. Well, let's move on, because one of the arguments I make so often is that some of these big stories cloud a lot of other important stories, and one that probably won't be covered anywhere except here on Point of View is one of the other articles I've posted. And this was a complete revelation to me, and that is that Planned Parenthood has been involved in providing advice to about 150 different movie productions. I'd never heard that before. And the way we found out about it, interestingly enough, is because some of the individuals at Planned Parenthood were bragging about it. This particular article, you can read it for yourself, says Planned Parenthood advised Hollywood on more than 150 productions since 2014 as part of an effort to influence the abortion dialogue, a director at the nonprofit said. Well, that director is Karen Sprunch, who is with the Planned Parenthood's Director of Arts and Entertainment. And so what they are pointing out there is Hollywood has been cooperating more and more with Planned Parenthood. And, of course, Cider House Rules is one years ago that seemed like it had the fingerprints of Planned Parenthood. But now the argument is that every one of those films that in any way, shape, or form could address the issue of abortion, she gets a phone call. Matter of fact, what she said is, nobody used to call me. I would be watching TV and going to the movies and figuring out who I thought might be open to including these storylines. Now I have a couple of repeat clients. Now people call me. And so she talks about a couple of the different examples in there. And sometimes they're not overt. But again, when you talk about this, there are some opportunities for where screenwriters discuss the issue of abortion, or in one way or another talk about birth control, abortion, sexually transmitted infections, and all those kinds of things. And so it illustrates again that you will never see a movie where a person gets an abortion and then feels regret. You're never going to probably see too many people that get a sexually transmitted disease, and you aren't going to see too many people that are going to have any kind of moral compunctions about even things like birth control, because if anything, Planned Parenthood is making sure that their message is really making a difference in the popular culture. So one of the things they point out is that sometimes right now Planned Parenthood seems to be losing the battle in Washington, but they're winning the battle in Hollywood. And as I've said on this program so many times before, politics is oftentimes downstream from culture. And so cultural influence through television, through the movies, through the internet, even through the kinds of articles that are allowed or not allowed in social media by the big tech, sometimes wash down eventually and have an influence in politics. So this is a story that you probably won't hear anywhere else. It was repeated in the Daily Caller, and it only really surfaced because they just feel so confident that they were willing to brag about the fact that they've had a profound impact in 150 different movies, including some of the movies maybe you've seen either in the theater or some of those movies then, of course, get played on television and you've seen them there. So one more reason to exercise a level of discernment about what you read, see, and hear. We'll take a break, got a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just mention that in the next hour, we're going to have Max Lucado with us for a while. Then I'll get back to this issue of impeachment and what that might mean. Then Matthew Staver will be with us. We'll be talking about this idea of restricting any kind of therapy that would help someone with same-sex attraction maybe to begin to remove his or her feelings in that regard, and that is about a law banning this in a place like Tampa, and that is a case that I suspect suspect could go to the Supreme Court, so we'll see where that takes us. And one of the other articles I've posted here is a very long article by Victor Davis Hanson called Our Privileged Scolds. And really what he does is talk about something we've mentioned before, and that is it's hard to take somebody really seriously if they're telling you need to change your behavior, but they're not changing their own behavior. And so he kind of takes us through Beto O'Rourke. He takes us through Warren, Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, kind of the big four, if you will, that get mentioned there, although he does mention Kamala Harris and a few others. But the point he's making is that they're basically saying, this is what you need to do, but I'm not doing it. And he ends by, and I'm just going to read the bottom line, but you can read the entire article, in which he has 5 simple commandments so that this would maybe stop a lot of the kinds of statements being made. Number 1, I will not lecture on the evils of gun ownership if I own a handgun or if anyone in my security detail carries one. Number 2, I pledge not to sermonize on the unfairness of wealth distribution or carbon emission greed if I own more than one home and if any of my homes are larger than 2,500 square feet. Number 3, if I continue to virtual signal about the Green New Deal, I promise that from this day forth, I will not fly on a private jet, not own a heated swimming pool or hot tub, not own or ride in an SUV, not own or use air conditioning. Number 4, I swear not to rail about the failure of the public schools in general, the evils of non-union and charter schools, and in particular the asymmetries of the quality of our education system if I place my children in private academies and prep schools or if I attended a private school myself. And then finally, I will cease pontificating about white privilege and white supremacy if I live in a nearly all-white, non-diverse neighborhood and my children have ever attended a wealthy, predominantly white school. The point he's making is, and it's a good one, is that these people will talk about the privileged rich. You've got to recognize every single one of those individuals just mentioned are multimillionaires, very, very wealthy individuals. And what you have sometimes going on in these debates is millionaires debating other millionaires about how the other millionaire doesn't care that much about the poor. Or they are talking about white privilege when they live and have benefited tremendously from white privilege, you know, and all the other kinds of issues that they will express the need for making sure that all of our kids go to the public schools when they send their kids to private schools, and on and on and on. So anyway, that's a very well-written piece by our good friend Victor Davis Hanson, and I love the 5 commandments there at the end. Okay, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about the fact that we are in the midst of Climate Week and the United Nations, and a lot of the issue is how much attention should we pay attention to some of the young children and teenagers that have actually been marching, because some of them have talked about the fact that you've stolen my dreams and my childhood and we'll be the last generation to survive. And the reality is probably not. I mean, let's be more honest. Definitely not. That is the case. And, you know, Ben Shapiro says it this way: we don't expect our children to have solutions. After all, they're children. But adults hiding behind children to avoid the difficult conversations that must take place about how to achieve solutions is nothing more than moral cowardice. You know, I'm not expecting a teenager who was involved in a shooting in Florida. I'm not expecting a teenager who came over here from Sweden or his marching in New York or wherever it might be to come up with solutions for what seems to be some significant changes in our climate. But I'm expecting adults to do so. And if all we do is rant and rave but don't have any solutions, then it's just ranting and raving. It's not going to get us any further down the road. Rich Lowry puts it this way: there's a reason we don't look to teenagers for guidance on issues of public policy, because he says, with rare exceptions, kids have nothing interesting to say to us. The exception, I'm using this, if nothing else, for Steve, the one exception he uses is philosopher John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill, who as a teenager and a child prodigy really gave us something to think about in terms of ethics. But by and large, if you're a teenager, by definition, you probably don't have a lot to say to us. And that's just fine. We're not asking you to say a lot. We're just asking you to recognize that the adults in the room really need to come up with some of the solutions. And as he points out here, what you're seeing are more and more of these. Matter of fact, National Geographic, I want it now. Kids, world climate strikes demand that warming stop fast. Okay, how do we do that? I don't know. And Dennis Prager had some comments about this as well, because his argument is if you can't sell hysteria to the adults, you sell it to the kids. And he says that takes us back to the children. If we can't sell the hysteria to adults, try kids, and that is what the left has done. After all, no one is as malleable or easily as indoctrinated, he says, as children. Consider this: if the left didn't tell them that the world is going to end, they wouldn't worry about it. They'd be enjoying their young lives, maybe even learning to appreciate that we live in the freest country at the most prosperous time in human history. Instead, thanks to leftists, who are children in adult bodies, he says, we live in a grip of existential eco-anxiety. The other day, I finally figured out why I heard some of these statements. You might have heard Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez say that she was concerned that these melting glaciers would release all of these viruses. And it turns out that Bill McKibben, in his book Falter, tells the story that indeed there was a situation in which a reindeer carcass that had been trapped in the permafrost, eventually as it began to melt, released anthrax. And so that actually affected some of the reindeer and infected some humans, and actually one boy died. And so then he raises the possibility that if indeed some of these glaciers melt, it might release fragments of Spanish flu, smallpox, even the bubonic plague. So finally I figured out, where did this come from? Well, it comes from his book, Falter. It also helps us understand why we've had some of the others, not just Alexandria, but Gretchen and others, say we only have a few years to live, because his argument is that if the oceans keep warming, now he says by 2100, okay, so he's using a different number, which the adults tend to use, but there's some that have been said, well, by 2030, which is what, 18 years, 12 years away. I mean, we are basically, we would maybe have the oceans warm enough that it would stop oxygen production by phytoplankton. And because they produce about 2/3 of the oxygen, it would lead to the mass mortality of animals and humans. But even in his book, he says this is the most extreme idea. But if all you did was read the first chapter or two, or you see this reprinted in social media, you would think that we only have 12 years to live before we run out of oxygen. And while we're talking about carbon dioxide, he also says that if the carbon dioxide level gets to a certain level, I think it's 1,000 parts per million, that we know that human cognitive ability drops by about 20%. So now I know where all this scare is coming from. It's little excerpts taken from this book. But the bottom line is, even he's saying these are the most extreme. These are kind of the book of Revelation kind of apocalyptic views. But when those get picked out, put in the social media, this is why you have these individuals who are convinced that we only have 12 years left before we all die, before we run out of oxygen, where there's too much carbon dioxide, and we're all going to die of the bubonic plague. So later this week, or maybe even in teaching time, I'm going to kind of exegete this book that I think is the source of so much of the fear and hysteria. Let's take a break, though. We'll come back and talk about happiness. Max Lucado with us right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We've got a lot to cover in the next couple of hours here. In just a minute, we're going to be talking with our good friend Max Lucado. And then after he goes, we're going to be talking about a few things in the news. Oh, like the impeachment, which will be a very important issue, as well as, of course, it's Climate Week at the United Nations. So we'll be talking about that. Second hour today, we'll also be talking with our friend Mat Staver about a very important court case. But all through that, we'll be looking at a number of issues in the news. And, of course, last night, we saw that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced that the House of Representatives is moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry. I'm going to spend some time a little bit later this hour and more even in the second hour talking about what that might mean. I'll give you a little bit of a timeline on the conversation that the president had with President Zelensky in Ukraine, and whether this is going to lead to impeachment proceedings and an actual vote. So there'll be lots of things to cover in the next couple of hours, and certainly all through the week. But I thought it would be wonderful for you to know about this new book by Max Lucado. I had a chance to hear him just the other day at Prestonwood Baptist Church. It is entitled How Happiness Happens. And this is an important issue because only 1 out of 3 Americans actually say they are happy. This is at a time when we have perhaps the greatest amount of freedom, the greatest amount of prosperity of any civilization in the history of the world, and yet only 1 out of 3 are happy. So we're going to talk about what that means from a biblical point of view. And if you're not familiar with Max Lucado, of course, an individual that was raised in Andrews, Texas, we oftentimes jokingly say there are more people in the membership of Oak Hills Church there in San Antonio, where he's the pastor, than in the town he grew up. And if you're not familiar with his books, well, then you haven't been paying attention, because there's 130 million products in print that have Max Lucado's name on them. And Max Lucado, it's always great to have you on the program with us.
Oh, Kerby, just hearing your voice is good. It's just really a treat. Thanks for letting me be on the program.
Well, let's just talk about that one statistic real quickly before we get into the one another verses in the Scripture. This is a time when you would think people would be happy. They don't have an impending war. The economy is doing relatively well. And yet there is so much political division, which gives me a lot to talk about every day, by the way. And there are all sorts of individuals that are dying from what I call the deaths of despair, suicide, opioid overdoses, and things like that. It just seems to me that happiness is something that seems to be elusive to the American people.
Well, smiles surely are in short supply, and it's a puzzle. It's a puzzle. 1 out of 3 Americans, and only 1 out of 3, describes themselves as happy. That means that 2 out of 3 people can't find the happiness, adequate happiness, to check the yes box on the questionnaire. And you know, this is a serious conversation, even though the topic is happiness. It's a serious conversation because happy people are healthier people. Happy people are more prosperous. Happy people really have happier marriages, and so there's so many good things that happen as a result of a sense of contentment and well-being, that it's concerning that so few people are really happy.
Well, again, what we are talking about is a book that just came out through Thomas Nelson, and about 200 pages. You have a happiness challenge in it. And I might just mention, especially for many of our listeners here that maybe would like to use this in their Sunday school class or their Bible fellowship or their small group, that a very significant section in the back prepared by Andrea Lucado, questions for reflection. And so even as we go through this fairly quickly and talk about the different 11 chapters that are there, if people wanted to study this individually, they certainly can do so. But as a pastor, I know that you've put this together in a way that could really be an ongoing discussion and a great Bible study that people could be doing in their sphere of influence.
This book was originally a series of lessons that I prepared for our church in San Antonio. I think it sets itself up well for a good study for like a Sunday school or home Bible study group, or even a series of sermons that a preacher might bring. Everybody wants to be happier. It's just finding that doorway to happiness. That's what seems so elusive.
Let's see if we can then get into the premise, and that is you have almost 6 different verses in the Bible that are so-called one another verses. Encourage one another, bear with one another, regard one another as more important, greet one another, pray for one another. And that really is the premise of the book, isn't it?
It really is. So yeah, the big idea, Kerby, is really happiness happens when we make other people happy. And that Jesus said it's more blessed to give than receive. And we live in a society that really urges us to try to receive more than we give, and that every day we are given messages that tell us to purchase happiness, or retire to happiness, or change houses for the sake of happiness. And I think a lot of this has to do with the simple fact that we live in the most thickly, thoroughly advertised generation in the history of the whole world. I grew up on the television. My daughters grew up in the internet, and now kids are being raised with social media. And all three of those come at us from all types of angles, reminding us that we need to buy product, and in order to get us to buy product, they have to convince us we're unhappy. I think that there's some kind of cycle that's going on in our minds as a result of this, and it's creating this deep dissatisfaction with life. Whereas the Bible says if you want to really be happy, it's not all about what you can do for yourself. It's really more about what you can do for others.
And one of the illustrations I love you use, and it's a little bit later in the book, but it's like if you have a basket of ping pong balls and you're going to call those joy balls, and first of all, you get up and you get on the scale. That'll get one of the joy balls out real quickly, and then you drive in the car, and that'll get rid of another one, and there's dirty clothes on the floor, which you talk about. There goes another joy ball, and you don't like somebody's makeup, you don't like their facial hair, you don't like their tattoos, you don't whatever, and pretty soon, all the joy balls have been removed from the basket, and you wonder why you're not happy. So it isn't just that Madison Avenue is making us unhappy. If we have our pet peeves or we don't have an appreciation or a sense of gratitude, those joy balls pop out of that basket pretty quickly, don't they?
They really do, and those joy balls are precious. I mean, they're precious. That's our happiness level, and we want to seek to maintain it. I want to also add, if I could, Kerby, I'm not talking about some silliness or superficiality or some fake smile on your face. Nobody wants that. Nobody needs that. Nobody wants us to have that. But what we do desire is that deeply rooted sense of contentment, that peace. Sometimes it manifests itself in a happy mood, and oftentimes it does. But sometimes it's just a steadiness. It's just a steadiness,
right.
An ability to face the challenges that life brings, to talk ourselves back off the ledge, to give ourselves a second chance, to be kind to ourselves. It's the ability to kind of navigate through life with a sense of well-being and peace.
We're going to take a break and continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Max Lucado. Then you'll have to head on somewhere else, and we'll get back into issues in the news. Let's focus on happiness before we get into some of the difficult things in the news. And that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The recent drone attack on the Saudi Arabian oil processing plant raises lots of questions that our leaders will need to answer quickly. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declared that it was an act of war by Iran, but confirming the link and deciding how to respond are just a few of the questions that need to be answered. The drone attack temporarily cut off an estimated 5% of the world's oil supply. President Trump authorized the release of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve if needed. It may not be needed since the U.S. is much closer to energy independence than it was in the past. Those of us who are older remember the oil shocks of the past. One of my co-hosts, who was born in the 1980s, only read about what it was like in the 1970s with the oil embargo and gas lines that sometimes spread for a mile. A few economists and government officials estimated that the U.S. and a few others could absorb the loss of Saudi oil production. How different it is today compared to a few decades ago. The drone attack on the oil plant also illustrated what could happen in this country to our energy grid or oil production facilities. The president did issue an executive order last March requiring federal agencies to assess and fix vulnerabilities of our electric grid. It might collapse by design through a foreign adversary like Iran or by accident through naturally occurring phenomenon. Frank Gaffney of the Center for Security Policy laments that some bureaucrats in the deep state don't seem very serious about studying and fixing the vulnerabilities of the U.S. energy grid. One bureaucrat in Homeland Security argued that the risk of electromagnetic pulses taking down the electric grid is overestimated. Frank Gaffney has a ready response. Want to bet? Think Saudi Arabia. The drone attack should be a wake-up call to get moving on protecting our energy grid. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Max Lucado. His new book out, How Happiness Happens, Finding Lasting Joy in a World of Comparison, Disappointment, and Unmet Expectations. Of course, you're just a master storyteller, Max, and of course, nothing else. I learned a little bit more about your brother D, about Buster, although it's not really his name, but nevertheless, a number of people in your life, and it takes really 10 of those one another verses on encouraging and bearing and regarding and greeting and praying and serving and accepting, admonishing and forgiving and loving different individuals and loving one another in 11 chapters, and really kind of deals with some of that. So let's, if we can, maybe talk about this idea of encouragement. Give me five, Rocky, is what you call it, but it's based upon 1 Thessalonians 5:11. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up. When I think of encouragement, I think of Barnabas, and I think of other people in my sphere of influence that when things aren't going well, they're encouragers. And all of us, no matter what our station in life is, Max, we need encouragers, don't we?
We do, because there's a discouragement conspiracy afoot. As we mentioned earlier, the advertising machinery depends on convincing me I am deficient and convince me I'll be sufficient upon the purchase of the product. And so I am reminded on a regular basis that my clothes are out of date, my car is too old, my hair is too thin, all these messages, and I'm discouraged. So we need people who are going to tell people the truth. And that's what encouragement is. Encouragement is the idea of coming alongside somebody and calling the best out of them. I call that chapter, Give Me Five, Rocky, because when Jesus heard the confession of Peter, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," he said, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah." And then he changed Simon's name to Peter. And it was a moment of great encouragement. He publicly said, way to go, Peter, way to go. I'm going to change your name from Simon to Peter, from Simon to Rocky, because you made such a rock-like confession. And he made a big deal out of it. And I think that we can do that as well. We can encourage people. I encourage people to call somebody up and say, "Can you give me 120 seconds so I can just tell you what a great person you are?" And then just let go. Build them up. Encourage them. Tell them what they mean for you and to you. You'll never regret doing that. You may actually change their lives by doing that, and you'll be the one happiest as a result.
Let me take another one because, again, we probably won't cover all 10, but again, that's why we encourage people to get a copy of the book. We have a link to your website. Of course, this book is available in hardback and Kindle. But one of those, I'll skip ahead, is The Sweet Sound of a Second Fiddle. And that's Philippians 2, regard one another as more important. Now, to be true, sometimes when you have been in studio off the air, we talk about the lack of civility in our world. And part of that comes from the fact that everybody's trying to get their team to win, their tribe to win. And there has just been a degradation of civility. But I think the first step towards civility, which I've written about in one of our little booklets, is regarding one another as more important, recognizing that I don't have all the truth, and your view, even if I may disagree with it, might have a grain of truth, and so I should be willing to listen to you. I should treat you as more important than myself. I should treat you as I would like to be treated. And so it's not just Philippians 2, it's also the golden rule, isn't it?
It really is. And Kerby, that's such a great observation on your part. And you are perfectly poised to make that observation because you really indwell this world of exchange of ideas. And people with whom you have regular contact can be very opinionated, can't they?
Oh, yes.
And disrespectful. And I also think you're making a great point that we tend to congregate. We want to congregate around the team that it's kind of like college football. I mean, we have these fierce allegiances and loyalties to our alma mater, and we cannot even bring ourselves to mention the name of the rival. You know, it's gotten really. Of course, it's one thing for that to happen in college football. It's another thing for that to happen in society, because what we sacrifice, at least potentially sacrifice, is the opportunity to have a good exchange, a knowledgeable exchange of ideas, and when that happens, problems that need to be solved go either unaddressed or unsolved.
Very good. One of the other ones I thought would be kind of fun is people might not necessarily think of this one, the fine art of saying hello, because in Romans it talks about greet one another, but you tell this funny story about this CEO. I think he kind of had it, and he said, "I'm going to take a leave of absence for a month. I'm not sure where I'm going and what I'm going to do, but I will not be here in the office." But you then talk about one of the others that said he left at least one very significant encouragement, and that is simply say good morning. And it is interesting that sometimes we overreact to the fact that you can see in the scriptures it says greet each other with a holy kiss. You see that in 1 Corinthians, you see it in 2 Corinthians, you see it in 1 Thessalonians. But there is a sense in which this idea of greeting and just being willing to say hello, which in our society is harder and harder because everybody's got their nose in one of these phones and they're not looking up where they're going, is certainly one other aspect of being an encourager, isn't it?
Absolutely. And thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, that's a great story. That CEO said, "I'm not coming back until you learn to get along with one another." And in his work, the company he owned, there was a lot of interaction between kind of the rough and tumble longshoremen, the dock workers, and those in the offices. It was some type of shipping business. And there was a kind of a macho culture that collided with the white-collar culture, and and the female culture, and it was just really getting worse and worse. He tried to help, but he just gave up. But good news is when he came back, they had learned to get along, and that was his instruction. Just at least greet one another. Mm-hmm. Don't you think it's interesting, Kerby, that the book of Romans, which Bible students recognize as kind of the great towering, the Yosemite of doctrine, right. Towering sequoias of doctrine are all in the book of Romans, and yet Paul took time to dedicate well over a dozen, maybe 15 verses to just saying, greet so-and-so, greet so-and-so, greet so-and-so. I would have thought that that's too trivial to put in the Bible. But what he's demonstrating for us there is this power that comes, the powerful art of encouraging people that comes just from saying hello to them. Because you never know, what may be small to you could really be huge to someone else.
Well, again, I love your wordsmithing, and I've got to at least mention that before we take a break. Paul had just spent 15 chapters, you say, guiding his readers through the Yosemite forest of Christian doctrine. Salvation by faith, sanctification, perseverance of the saints, predestination, and election. And then in chapter 16, he took up the curious and unexpected crusade of kind greetings. In a meadow of oaks and elms, this command feels like a sapling, but again, just a great illustration, not only of some of the insight in there, but just the incredible writer that you have been all these years. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about a couple of the others. One obvious one that we'll start with is the idea of the power posture. Pray for one another, which is in James, and we'll also spend a little bit of time talking about the importance of forgiving one another, because as you mentioned just the other day when you were preaching, this is so significant to forgive one another, and interestingly enough, nothing so sucks joy out of the lives of individuals like anger and retaliation and a demand for justice. And even a Duke University study of the 8 characteristics of happiness, 4 of those have to do with forgiveness. So we're going to talk about prayer, going to talk about forgiveness, and it's all part of this new book, How Happiness Happens, Finding Lasting Joy in a World of Comparison, Disappointment, and Unmet Expectations. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to get a copy of the book, you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. But we also, of course, have a link so that you can get it in hardback or Kindle. We also have a link to Max Lucado's website. You can, of course, find it there as well. It's maxlucado.com, and there you have all sorts of information, his books, his store, some other information about him as well. And so all of that is available at our website, pointofview.net. And if you would like to certainly know more about him, you can click on that particular link. If you'd like to listen to this again, because even though we will not cover all the chapters in the book, you can certainly go to our website, pointofview.net, and download by clicking on that button that says Listen, the podcast, or of course you can go to the YouTube channel and watch it again as well. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with our friend Max Lucado right after these important messages.
It is a horrible scenario, but it happens. Dennis writes about his wife who was diagnosed with leukemia. She's now a 2-time survivor. They ran up over $1 million in medical bills. Thankfully, they're Medi-Share members, and Dennis says they're so thankful for that, how people came together to meet their needs. Medi-Share works, and it could save you a lot of money. The typical family saves $500 a month. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
Every day we face new challenges. At the time of Jonah, the Bible says in Nineveh, they couldn't tell their right hand from their left. But in America today, a bunch of people can't tell men from women. In fact, some say men can be women. Christians are called to proclaim God's truth in every area of life. But who has time to study every crazy new thing the world can think of? I'm glad you asked. Get the information you need every day with Kerby's Viewpoints commentary. Sign up to receive them via email at pointofview.net/viewpoints or find them on the Point of View radio app. Viewpoints commentaries, making sense of the world around us. pointofview.net/viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation for a few more minutes with our friend Max Lucado. How happiness happens, finding lasting joy in a world of comparison, disappointment, and unmet expectations. 10 very important principles of the again, serving one another, loving one another, praying for one another, even, and as we'll talk about in just a minute, forgiving one another. But those are principles that we need to apply in our lives. And Max, if we can, maybe just to do 3 very quickly before I know you have to go. And one of those is to pray for one another. That one maybe should have been the one we started with, but it's later in the book. But this idea of prayer is not only important for praying for others, but you wouldn't think that praying would bring happiness, but that's exactly what we find, isn't it?
Yeah, we really do, and that's interesting. Very, very perceptive of you to point that out, because we typically think of prayer as something that benefits others, and obviously it does.
Sure.
Without a doubt. And if it never benefited us, we would still pray. But prayer helps those who pray.
Yes.
I'm thinking especially of those who feel like they just don't know how to help somebody. They don't know how to reach out to their prodigal children, for example. They don't know what to say to somebody who's just lost a loved one. And they feel like there's nothing they can do. And as a result, they feel exasperated or sad or burdened. But there's always something you can do, and that is you can always pray. Even if you cannot talk to the person, even if you don't know what to say to the person, you can pray for that person. And prayer is simply the act of bringing somebody you loved into the presence of Christ. And when you do that, what you're doing is you are lifting the burden from your shoulders that you carry for that burden, and you're carrying that burden to Christ. We're never told to keep burdens forever. We carry burdens until we can help people find a solution. But if we try to carry all the burdens of the world, we'll be weighed down. So the goal is to feel the weight of sadness or concern for a person and carry those burdens to Christ and leave them there.
Let me come back to the point I made just a minute ago. One study at Duke University concluded after looking at 1,500 reputable medical studies that people who are more religious and pray more have better mental and physical health. It went on to even say that those individuals tend to cope with stress better. They experience greater well-being because they have more hope. They're more optimistic. They experience less depression, less anxiety, and they commit suicide less often. So praying is something that we're admonished to do. That should be reason enough. But a secondary, if you will, benefit is when you pray, you'll be healthier, and that's a good thing. So let me get to another one, and it kind of relates, and that is the idea that we should serve one another. In the past, Max, we've had some counselors, and sometimes they will tell us stories about talking with one of these patients or somebody that's coming in dealing with depression, and oftentimes they'll prescribe, well, then you go out and serve someone else. And they go, wait a minute, you don't understand. No, I'm depressed. People need to minister to me. And he's going, no, as you give out, you will receive. And that is one of those ideas in Scripture that are counterintuitive. You know, he would be first, would be last. He who would actually be able to be served will go out and serve. And so that's one of those interesting principles that we as Christians understand, but sometimes the world has difficulty trying to put their head around.
It's a fundamental principle in the Bible. Jesus described that he came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many people. And so when we serve others, we're immediately placing ourselves in the posture that Christ took. You know, the thing about it, when I was a kid, we used to play King on the Mountain. You remember that game,
Oh, yes.
Kerby?
Oh, yes.
So, you find some hill in the middle of a pasture or something, and whoever can get up to the top and claim the top is the king. But everybody's trying to pull the king off the top. That's really a picture of society, isn't it?
Yes.
We all want to everybody wants to be on the top, but listen, there's always room at the bottom. There's plenty of space. If you don't want to obsess yourself with getting to the top, you're going to be a lot happier because there's a lot more room down below. You be the one, for example, who every morning wakes up, instead of saying, the world exists to serve me, you take the attitude that says, I exist to serve the world. Now, if you take the first attitude, you're not going to be very happy because nobody else is waking up today saying, I exist to serve Max. But if Max wakes up and says, I exist to serve the world, then Max is going to be happy because there's always going to be opportunities to serve others.
Very good. Just before I let you go, let's, if we can, focus on another one, and that is forgive one another as quickly and thoroughly as God in Christ forgave you, which is Ephesians 4:32. And I've heard you preach on this. And by the way, I think it's a good illustration that you preached an entire sermon just on basically one chapter in your book. So it illustrates, again, how much depth is there. But I mentioned just a minute ago one of these Duke University studies that when they looked at these characteristics of happiness, half of those characteristics have to do with forgiveness. And so I've said before on this program many times, forgive someone else, even if you don't want to forgive them, just because it's good for you, just because it takes that vengeance that you might have, that anger, that desire for retaliation away from you. And forgive others, not only because you're commanded to do so, but also because it's very good therapy for you.
That's right. And these research projects document what intuitively we already know, don't we, Kerby? We know we're not happy when we're harboring a grudge. We understand that we're not at our best when we're angry at others. It's just sometimes it's very, very difficult. And so in the book we talk about why forgiving one another matters and what forgiving one another is. Just for example, one idea, forgiving is not endorsing. You're not saying what that person did is right. Basically what you're saying is, I'm going to entrust my perpetrator into the hands of God and believe that God is the one who knows exactly what happened, and he alone can bring about the proper balance of justice. So there's some nuances to forgiveness that are very important. But the big idea is that you'll be a better person. You'll really be a better person when you release that resentment. And you talk about something that I think is really running rampant in our streets today. That is a situation where people are allowing their hurts to become hates. And those hates become racism. They become patterns of violence. And left unchecked, they can cause a person to be very, very unhappy.
Just before we let you go, you have a happiness challenge, which, first of all, I got to admit, men admit this, but even reading the story here about this young man who was not able to see actually just makes you kind of cry because it's such a powerful story of Jake Olson. But then, in addition to the happiness challenge, you've got a whole section here on questions for reflection. So just before I let you go, talk about how people can use this book, because it is something that I think is certainly a book that we would all want to read individually. But I know we have a lot of pastors, Sunday school teachers, Bible fellowship leaders, small group leaders that listen to this program, and they might be looking for a book or a resource that they could begin to teach to others. How can they do so?
When we studied this at our church, we challenged every member to take on this happiness challenge. And that means over 40 days, try to make 100 people happy. It's that simple. You cannot control, but you can try to influence the happiness of 100 people. You can put these one another verses to work, or you may try some others. But keep a journal and share your ideas with others. Another idea is to do this in an accountability group or a small group or a circle of friends. It really makes for a great semester of study to look at these one another verses as ways that not only increase the happiness of others, but increase happiness wherever you are.
Max Lucado, it's always just great to have you in studio or even today by phone, and appreciate so many of the great books that you've written over the years. We appreciate your heart, your pastor's heart especially, but also just the incredible wordsmith that you are, and it is a delight to have you on the program, and I always look forward to the next opportunity.
I'll look forward to it as well, Kerby. Thank you so very much. It's an honor to be on the program.
We're going to take a break, and let me just mention before we do so, the book, one more time, is entitled How Happiness Happens, Finding Lasting Joy in a World of Comparison, Disappointment, and Unmet Expectations. About 200 pages, published by Thomas Nelson. It's just coming out, so you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. Kind of a who's who of all sorts of individuals that have endorsed this book, and many of whom have been on this program with us before. And so I would recommend the book to you and encourage you to maybe think about how you might even teach it in a small group or in your church. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again. It was great to hear from Max Lucado, but we got a lot of things on the table, not the least of which is an impeachment inquiry. And let me just mention real quickly before we do take our top of the hour break that we do encourage you to consider what you might do to join with us on the Truth Team. We had our Truth Team week last week, and some people have said, well, how did you do? I think we eventually met our match. It was very difficult to do so, but we were not able to meet our goal, so there is still room for you to join listening with us. I think there are about 250 gifts, but I think we probably have a few more listeners than 250 people. So that means there's still room for you, and you can go to our website, pointofview.net. And I'm encouraging some of you that maybe have been listening for a while, but you've never sent a donation of any size in. Let me encourage you just to maybe click on that button and maybe even make a one-time gift. That would be greatly appreciated. And, of course, if you would like to talk to someone, our pledge line number is open, 800-347-5151. I'll have more to say about that in just a minute. And let me just mention that the idea of impeachment is sort of going to dominate even today, and certainly dominate a lot of other radio programs. And one of the reasons we like to, especially in the next hour, talk about a few other topics is there are a lot of other issues that are on the table, one of which I'll talk about next hour, how Planned Parenthood now is bragging that they've actually had an influence in about 150 different Hollywood movies, even though Planned Parenthood is starting to lose some battles in Washington, D.C., they're starting to win some in the popular culture in Hollywood, and that's one of the articles we've posted. Another one by Victor Davis Hanson, Our Privileged Scolds, about individuals that are saying, you need to change your behavior, but I'm not going to change mine, and we'll get into some of that in the next hour. But let's focus for just a few minutes on the impeachment. Last night, you have, of course, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, saying, I'm announcing the House of Representatives is moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry. And as Jim Garrity points out in one of his pieces, that last word matters because it's an inquiry. In some respects, she didn't ask for anything more than what has already been put forward in the House Judiciary Committee with Representative Jerry Nadler. And so they've already had an impeachment inquiry, but where is that going to take us? And I might spend a little more time in the next hour trying to explain why the president even asked the president there of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, to look into Joe Biden. As a matter of fact, now since we have the transcript, or some people are not calling it a transcript, but a recollection, it said there's a lot of talk about Biden's son. By the way, that would be Hunter Biden, that Biden stopped the prosecution. A lot of people want to find out whether that's so, and we can do with the attorney general would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so you can look into it. And those are the statements in the transcript or recollection about the involvement of Hunter Biden. And certainly I'll get into that in just a few minutes. But I would make a prediction that it's possible that we will get a vote on impeachment. Newt Gingrich the other day made that statement, and you never want to bet against Newt Gingrich. Sometimes he sees things clearer than others. But if you look at the New York Times count, they estimate that there are 204 House Democrats that support impeachment. Well, if you're wondering, it only takes 218 to pass a piece of legislation. Can Nancy Pelosi find 14 more individuals? Probably. I mean, almost certainly. Can you imagine what it would be like for a Democrat not to vote for impeachment? You could have the Democratic National Committee say, well, we will not send you any money for your re-election campaign. We will maybe even try to find someone to run against you in the primary. So that's at least a possibility. But on the other hand, Nancy Pelosi, if she looks at any of the polls at all, the most recent poll says only about 35% of Americans think that impeachment is a good idea. And so that's not exactly a winning strategy, given the fact especially that a very significant number of Democrats are in congressional districts that actually were won by Donald Trump. And how it's kind of interesting. Sean Hannity even put that list up the other day and called out some of those. So it will be interesting to see where that goes. So we now have the transcript. We now know a little bit more about it. But let me real quickly, before we take a break, give you some of the timeline. Some of you might be asking a really good question. Why did Donald Trump bring this up in the first place? And I think you have to say that this timeline is part of the understanding that is being used right now to explain why impeachment needs to take place. But if you understand the timeline, you can understand that he may have brought it out because of some of the investigation that has been done by Peter Schweitzer, who's been on the program before, and certainly some questions about Hunter Biden being on this energy company in Ukraine, the kind of money that was exchanged back and forth, and then the attempt by the vice president to prevent any further prosecution. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence of a quid pro quo because you can answer, hopefully, 3 questions. Question number 1, what came first? You have the phone call with Zelensky, President Zelensky, and that took place on July 25th. But before that time, there was already a decision by the Trump administration to withhold the $391 million in military aid to Ukraine, and that came first. Number 2, then, let's answer this question. What motivated the Trump administration to withhold that military aid? And that is, according to the White House, the primary concern was corruption within the Ukrainian government. Moreover, if you go and look at an article that appears in the Washington Examiner, it reported that the Trump administration back then was trying to determine whether this newly elected president, President Zelensky, whether he was pro-West or pro-Russia. And so then you have, fast forward to September 2nd, a meeting between the Vice President, Mike Pence, and President Zelensky. And the following day, he said, as President Trump has made clear, we have great concern about issues of corruption. So certainly there were still some hesitation about the issue of corruption. Maybe at that point it allayed some of the fears that the vice president had about whether or not he was pro-Western or pro-Russian, which leads to then the third issue. When were these funds released? And actually they were released 10 days later, September 12th. But who was leading the charge to release those actual funds? Well, that would be the Democrat, Dick Durbin. He's a Democrat. By the way, the same Democrats now that want to impeach the president, but that's another story there. And he wanted to force the Trump administration to release those funds. In the House of Representatives, you've had the Republicans like in the Senate, Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana, but also those in the House. And interesting enough, John Kennedy actually stated in one of these articles, we support Ukraine, period, end of discussion. And so really you had both Republicans and Democrats in the Senate and also Republicans in the House that were willing to release those funds. And you might even wonder why the Democrats are pushing for it so much. But nevertheless, I think you can say that that had nothing to do necessarily with the investigation of Hunter Biden or Joe Biden. Had everything to do with some very reasonable concerns about corruption and also some lingering concerns about whether this newly elected president, Zelensky, was pro-American or at least pro-West or whether he's pro-Russian. So when we come back, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking with our friend Mat Staver about a law that's restricting any kind of same-sex therapy. And then we'll come back into some more of those issues, and we'll open up the phones to get your comments, because I think some of you perhaps have some thoughts about whether or not we should have impeachment proceedings against the President of the United States. So there's a lot that we're going to be covering today, and if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to read a little bit more, we have an article about the impeachment proceedings. We have an article about the Ukrainian transcript and some of that information. And we have some of the other ones by Victor Davis Hanson and even the one about Planned Parenthood. It's all at our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll chat with Mat Staver, get an update on that particular court case. And we'll get back into all of these issues in the media right after these important messages.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Is that we're going to spend just a little bit of time with our friend Mat Staver, first of all, talking about a very important case that has really national implications. So whether you live in the state of Florida or in a variety of other states, there has been an attempt to try to ban anything that could be described in the broadest possible way as conversion therapy. And so we'll get into what that means and what that ban is and why they have challenged that. And also really want to encourage you to, if you have any questions about this, to ask while he's still on the line. And then we're going to get back to, of course, the big issues in the news. A couple of those are, of course, the issue of impeachment, as well as we're going to talk about the fact that it's Climate Week there in the United Nations. And we, of course, have had all sorts of statements being made about the Green New Deal and about climate change and a climate crisis and climate alarmism and those kinds of issues, as well as one of the articles I've posted here on the fact that Planned Parenthood now bragging that they've had influence in more than about 150 movies and shows out of Hollywood. So we've got a lot to cover, and we will do so. But let me bring, first of all, to the microphone Mat Staver, senior pastor, founder, chairman of Liberty Council, chairman of the Liberty Council Action, individual that has for many years really stood up for various religious liberty issues, but this one also has to do with the issue of sexual orientation and same-sex therapy. And so we're going to give you a chance to hear a little bit more about what he has to say. And if you have any comments or questions, you might want to ask those while he's with us. That number is 1-800-351-1212. Mat Staver, tell us a little bit more about this lawsuit. You filed a motion for judgment on this issue of what is happening in Tampa. Tell us the background, if you might.
Yes, and this is just one of several lawsuits that we have. But actually yesterday we had the what's called summary judgment hearing, meaning that we've gone through all of the discovery, depositions, and all the investigation, and we submitted all of this, both sides, to the judge, and it's ready for determination. We don't need to go to a trial. All of the issues have been fleshed out, and so all of the information, all the expert testimony, everything is in front of the judge at this point in time. So we had a very good hearing yesterday. Just to give you an idea of some of the issues involved, this law in Tampa, like several others around the country, ban any counsel from a counselor to a client and prohibit any client from receiving counsel to overcome unwanted same-sex attractions, behavior, or gender confusion. In other words, they come to a counselor and they're struggling with whether they're homosexual or not. They're struggling with the kind of behavior that they may be tempted to engage in or are engaging in. Or they're going through this gender confused state as to whether they're the opposite sex or not, or no sex or a combination of both. They're going through this confused state, and they seek a counselor, and they want to overcome that. They want to align their feelings in their life in accordance with their values, whether it's biblical values or anything else. They want to overcome that stress. So they seek a counselor to help them overcome that, to address it. In Tampa and in about 18 states, including the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and about 52 local municipalities, counties, or local governments, that's banned. So you can't get the kind of counsel. In fact, the kind of counsel that the counselor is only authorized in these different jurisdictions to do is to override your desire. In other words, you don't want to be, you don't think that you're homosexual, but you're having these homosexual thoughts or tendencies, temptations, for example. and you don't want to go down that road. Well, the counselor in these areas has to not allow you to even ask or go down that road, but instead override your desire and tell you, don't worry about it. Yeah. You just need to accept it. This is how you are. This is how you're going to be. You're never going to change. And that's not what the client is seeking. It's, if you imagine any other area of life where you go there, you're having depression, whatever it might be, and you want to overcome that. You want help to resolve that. And the counselor tells you, don't try to overcome it. That's just who you are. You're going to be like that for the rest of your life. That is demoralizing, it's depressing, and frankly, it's dangerous.
It seems to me that the arrow goes one direction. If you had somebody who says, you know, I'm heterosexual, but I'm feeling that maybe I would actually want to, in one way or another, engage in homosexuality, they'd say, well, go and be that way. But if somebody says, I'm homosexual and I've been engaged in this some time, but I'd like to be heterosexual, well, no, we can't counsel that direction. We can bring you out, but we can't put you back in, to use the kind of quaint phrases. Is that fair?
That's fair. In fact, the city attorney was being grilled for 2 hours straight before we got up and spoke, and the judge grilled them on questions just like that. For example, the judge said that there is this young boy or a young man, and this young man has had gender confusion and wants to be a girl and started going down that path of hormones, but then has second thoughts and ultimately becomes to the point where they don't want to go down that path. They want to be content with who they are, how they were born as male. They go get a counselor, and can that person get counseling? And they said, well, it depends upon whether or not they had those thoughts before they go into the counselor or whether those thoughts came about as a result of the counselor. And the judge just jumped all over them and said, well, who's going to figure that out? How many people are able to walk into the counseling session and make those kinds of minute details? The fact of the matter is, what this does, it's a one-way street, that they want to push you towards homosexuality, they want to push you to transgenderism. But if you're already down that road, or you're being tempted to go down that road, or you're confused about it, and you don't want to go down that road, maybe you want to reverse and you go back. Maybe you've had a change or conversion and you want to now, and you're struggling with certain behavior, and you want to align your practices, your life, with your value system. The counselor can not only not help you, but the counselor has to try to override you and put you into a box that you don't want to be in. And that's where the danger is. It's not only a violation of the First Amendment, but it certainly puts people's lives in danger. And there's no other area in which the government barges into a counseling room or to a medical room and tells the doctor or the counselor that you can only give one viewpoint, and you can't even address or help the client address issues of their own concern.
Yes. Well, and it reminded me a little bit of some of what doesn't happen as much now, but back in the 1980s, we had these so-called clergy malpractice lawsuits. Yeah. And the argument was that, which was being made by the various defense attorneys, what expertise does the court, does a secular court have with what a person in the clergy has? Do they have expertise in seminary and theological education? And of course the answer is no. What expertise does the city of Tampa have in terms of counseling therapy and those kinds of things? I want to come back to that, but I also want to take some phone calls, because if you'd like to join us, we already got one call that I'm going to get to in just a minute, but we'll take a couple others. 1-800-351-1212. This, of course, is just one case that we've talked about in Tampa, but as Mat Staver has pointed out, we are talking about many other similar kinds of laws, cases, and others. And so it gets us into this idea of so-called conversion therapy, and whether or not that kind of therapy or any kind of counseling practice can be banned by a state, by a city council. So we'll get into some of that conversation with Mat Staver. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The recent drone attack on the Saudi Arabian oil processing plant raises lots of questions that our leaders will need to answer quickly. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declared that it was an act of war by Iran, but confirming the link and deciding how to respond are just a few of the questions that need to be answered. The drone attack temporarily cut off an estimated 5% of the world's oil supply. President Trump authorized the release of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve if needed. It may not be needed since the U.S. is much closer to energy independence than it was in the past. Those of us who are older remember the oil shocks of the past. One of my co-hosts, who was born in the 1980s, only read about what it was like in the 1970s with the oil embargo and gas lines that sometimes spread for a mile. A few economists and government officials estimated that the U.S. and a few others could absorb the loss of Saudi oil production. How different it is today compared to a few decades ago. The drone attack on the oil plant also illustrated what could happen in this country to our energy grid or oil production facilities. The president did issue an executive order last March requiring federal agencies to assess and fix vulnerabilities of our electric grid. It might collapse by design through a foreign adversary like Iran or by accident through naturally occurring phenomenon. Frank Gaffney of the Center for Security Policy laments that some bureaucrats in the deep state don't seem very serious about studying and fixing the vulnerabilities of the U.S. energy grid. One bureaucrat in Homeland Security argued that the risk of electromagnetic pulses taking down the electric grid is overestimated. Frank Gaffney has a ready response. Want to bet? Think Saudi Arabia. The drone attack should be a wake-up call to get moving on protecting our energy grid. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Mat Staver, and again, Chairman of Liberty Counsel. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to Maine first, WSEW. Steve, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. Yeah, you know, I wanted to just mention, I just think this is so obvious, and you guys have touched on that already, that it's one-sided. I think it's interesting, though, that there are some other things that have happened previous to this, kind of like building up to this. And I think of one where I've been actually involved with my children going to their physician, children's physician, and being asked questions where the parents are asked to leave the room.
Wow.
And that's happening often. And these are minor children. And, you know, we were appalled when we were asked this, but it's not anything that's uncommon. It's actually very common practice now. This kind of thing where government has taken over and taken over raising a family. And it's kind of, yeah, it's just surprising. It's surprising that people aren't appalled more and saying, what is going on? And yes, this is one-sided, and it's a constitutional violation. I can understand, actually, people not knowing it's a constitutional violation because, quite frankly, the Constitution is made into a piece of rag now, and people just toss it around like it's an oiled rag. You know, they just don't see the value, and they say, well, it doesn't pertain these days, and you know, they need to be re-educated.
Yeah,
but
well, that's kind of what we're doing at Point of View. Yeah, let me get some comments there because, Matt, this is kind of a key point. We've in the past talked about when we were talking about homeschools or even child protective services or other kinds of things. There's this kind of growing assumption that parents are inadequate, maybe the families are dysfunctional, so the government just needs to step in. Doctors need to ask intrusive kinds of questions, and we do want to protect children from any kind of abuse, but it seems to me it's going the wrong direction. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it definitely goes the wrong direction. And so what they're doing here is they're saying, well, the parents are forcing the kids to get this counseling. What they don't understand is that in counseling, there are ethical codes, and the client is the individual that they're counseling. And so if the client doesn't want to go down this particular road, the counselor has ethical codes that can prohibit the counselor from forcing them to go down this particular road. So if their client, in this particular case, it would be the person that they're counseling, the minor. If their client feels like they're being forced to go down a particular way by somebody else, parents or otherwise, the counselor can't force that client. The counselor has to deal with that client. That really involves these parents in so many different ways because the situations that develop are this. A young boy, we've had different kinds of parents and children that we've dealt with, many of them. A young boy, for whatever reason, there's different kinds of reasons. It could be that the person was sexually molested by an uncle. That's a frequent way, particularly with boys. It could be that they were sexually molested by one of their peers. Sexual molestation on young boys is a frequent cause, if you go back and peel the layers of the onion away, about why some people will have, boys particularly, same-sex attractions. So they end up having problems about who they are, their identity. They have peer problems. They end up having problems in their relationship with their parents. Some of them think about hurting themselves. And then they eventually come to their mom and dad and they tell them, I've had these feelings, and or maybe even I've just got this depression, I've got this anxiety. So they talk to their child, and this is the typical pattern. They seek out a professional, a counselor, and they take that child to the counselor, and the child confides in the counselor. It may not be that they start off the counseling session with someone who has unwanted same-sex attractions. Maybe that they just have anxiety, self-esteem problems. But during that process, they find out there's other things going on, and that's what ultimately is causing the self-esteem, this desire to hurt, this problem with their peers, with their family, and they start talking about that. And what we've seen is dramatic changes in these young boys and girls' lives when they get the right kind of counseling for the better in terms of their self-esteem, their relationship with their peers, and their parents. And yet now what is happening is these states, these cities, are saying that kind of counsel you can no longer get. In fact, we want to force you as a child into a mold that neither you nor your parents nor anyone else wants you to go into because we think it's best. It is a very pro-aggressive LGBT agenda that has serious consequences.
Well, and again, it's almost like as soon as you stumble into, well, that may be the reason why you're having anxiety, it's almost like, okay, I can't say anything more about it. And again, what expertise does the Tampa City Council, does a Florida legislature, does a California legislature have in terms of counseling? But let's take some more phone calls real quickly because since I mentioned California, we'll go out to California. Adam, what's your point of view today?
Well, hello. Thank you for taking my call. I grew up with homosexuals in my family, a brother and a cousin, and I could see how, I'm going to be 42, how distorted your identity is getting when it comes to, losing the concept of the fear of God or even the truth of the word, which is always one-sided. You either are all in or you're all out. And when it comes to your sexual preference or your sexual desire, it's like now they want you to say what you feel about it, and it's acceptable more than what the truth of your identity is as a child of God.
Yeah, trust your feelings, trust your gender labeling, and don't trust any kind of scientific evidence or any kind of therapy or expertise of the counselor. And so, if nothing else, just before we run out of time here, Matt, I thought we might talk a little bit about, first of all, we have a link to Liberty Counsel. Of course, this is the case in Tampa, but it's just one of many examples around the country. And as you get some kind of summary judgment or pursue this a little bit further, we'd love to have you come back. But let's talk about this, because there may be people listening in 40 other states besides Florida saying, well, we got the same issue in our city council, or we've got this issue being considered in the legislature. Are you available to provide them with some kind of help and counsel?
We are, for sure. In fact, we have pending litigation in California, New Jersey, Maryland, Florida, and other states. And as I mentioned, there's 18 states plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico that have these statewide laws. And 52, and that number keeps growing, local municipalities or governments that have these laws, like, for example, Tampa, the city of Tampa. So it's growing, it's widespread, and there's efforts to get that passed through the UN, through federal government. But we're also available. So just contact us. You can go to our website, lc.org, or you can call us at 407-875-1776. We're certainly available to walk you through this and to litigate if necessary, because these are very dangerous laws. Here's the final thing I want to say. It's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when the Supreme Court will ultimately take one of these cases, perhaps one of our cases, and overturn these nationwide. They've already tipped their hat that they don't agree with these kinds of bans. And that was in a case last year, the crisis pregnancy case in 2018. So we're working to get one of these cases back up to the Supreme Court.
Let me just encourage people to, first of all, pray about these cases, also to support you. Of course, you have offices in Florida and Virginia as well as in Washington, D.C., so those are some opportunities for people, again, to contact you. We have all that information at the website. It's just simply LC, real easy to find, .org. And again, you can click on that button. And it's just one of those cases that, like you said, is inhibiting not only the free speech of individuals, but the freedom of association, and preventing counselors who, as they are maybe even just counseling somebody dealing with anxiety or depression or sexual addiction, then find the deeper root that takes it back to this issue of homosexuality. But as soon as that happens, it's like, well, you can't do any conversion therapy, so we'll just have to leave you right there. And it just, again, underscores the fact that some of these government entities are taking on responsibility and claiming expertise that they don't have. And so I appreciate you being on the front lines for that. And if this case goes to the Supreme Court, we're going to be talking to you quite often. So Mat Staver of Liberty Counsel, always great to have you in the program, and we look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, all right, let's get back into the issue of impeachment. And this last half hour is kind of an open line, so maybe you have some thoughts about this. I want to explain a little bit, why did President Donald Trump even bring this up? Our friend Peter Schweitzer has actually written about this in his book, Secret Empires, how the American political class hides corruption and enriches family and friends. So this is well documented, but we'll talk a little bit about Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, and why this was investigated in the first place. Then we'll look at the prospects for impeachment and then get into a couple of other stories we've posted. All that coming up right after this.
So when people first hear about Medi-Share, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, Medi-Share is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become Medi-Share members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With Medi-Share, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. And so let's get those phone calls set up there, and we'll take your calls in just a minute. Let me, again, just to kind of refocus some of our time and attention, again, I do want to mention a little bit later, before the program is over, some other issues that I think are very important as well. But, of course, right now, this issue of impeachment is sort of dominating the news, and I understand that. And, again, the transcript was made available today. Now, some people are saying it's not a transcript, it's a recollection. Okay, that's something maybe we'll talk about a little bit more with Gary Bauer, who'll be with us on Friday, since he was in the West Wing, and he understands that. What I understand is in the Situation Room, as the president makes a phone call, there are a number of people kind of taking notes, typing as quickly as they can, and then they come together and try to have some kind of basic summary. And it's almost word for word, if not exactly word for word for what was said. But again, some are saying, well, it's really not a transcript. Well, we don't have a tape, so it's the best we've got. But nevertheless, if you read the transcript or the recollection, whatever you want to call it, you have the statement by the president. There's lots of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution. A lot of people want to find out about it. So whatever you can do with the attorney general would be great. And so that's kind of the implication. You might say, why did he even bring that up? And again, as I mentioned just as we were coming to the break, that Peter Schweitzer, who's been on this program with us before, wrote a book called Secret Empires. And that one actually gives the documentation for everything I'm going to say. And I'm only going to give you a couple of key points. And that is, in that book, he documents that Joe Biden's son, whose name is Hunter Biden, joined the board of the Ukrainian energy company. And then, according to bank records, that is the case. But also, Hunter Biden had little background in energy, but over the next 16-month period, about $3 million ends up in the bank account associated with Hunter Biden's businesses. So that looks like some kind of connection there. Vice President Joe Biden led the administration's policy towards Ukraine, helped shape Ukraine's energy and anti-corruption policies. That also had a positive impact on the energy company there in Ukraine. The energy company also tried to capitalize on Hunter Biden's name and relationship. And you can go to the New York Times to find this out, because it points out that Hunter Biden helped assemble the company's legal team, the American attorneys, consulting firms, and all of the rest. And then there came to be some concerns about this one oligarch who was the ecology minister under the pro-Russian former Ukrainian leader. And so as a result, there was an investigation of the energy company and Hunter Biden. And then, of course, that's where, of course, you have the claim being made, interestingly enough. Matter of fact, that shows up on the transcript here as well. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution. So you can look into it, is what, again, President Trump said. And so I think I've tried to answer the questions that people have of, was there a quid pro quo between the president of the United States and the president of Ukraine in terms of that particular amount of military policy, which is, what, $391 million? The answer is no. There is pretty good evidence that that was held for a while because of corruption and really wanting to determine whether or not the incoming president, Zelensky, whether or not he was kind of pro-Russian or pro-Western. So those are a couple of those key issues that are related to that. And in just a minute, I also want to focus on one other topic, and that is the possible dangerous precedent of releasing one of these transcripts from a conversation the president has had. But let's take some phone calls first. So let's go, first of all, to KBJS in Texas. John, I understand you've been making some phone calls. What have you found out today? Oh, we just lost him. Okay, I guess we just lost. I went on him just as he was hanging up. John, call back, and I'll get to you in just a minute. Okay, let me take on that issue that I just mentioned. I probably should have got him earlier, and you might have had to go somewhere. And I understand that people don't have a chance to sit on hold very long. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let me get back to one of the really interesting phenomenon because for the last couple of days, you've been hearing everyone saying that we need to impeach the president. We need to see the transcript, or some people are calling the recollection. And so then you have this posting by Donald Trump that simply says, I'm currently at the United Nations representing our country, but have authorized the release tomorrow of the complete, declassified, and unredacted transcript of my phone conversation with President Zelensky of Ukraine. And so as a result, then everybody was calling for the transcript. As soon as he said he was going to release the transcript, then you have this statement by Michael McFaul. This is a big mistake, terrible precedent, as no foreign leaders in future will speak candidly with the president on any future calls. Don't release the Trump-Zelensky or the Trump-Putin transcripts of calls. Instead, release the whistleblower's complaint to Congress as required by law. First of all, the whistleblower's complaint doesn't matter now because we've got the transcript. So we actually know that the whistleblower only got this secondhand. So now, by reading the transcript, you know more than the whistleblower. So we don't need the whistleblower, that's for sure. But more importantly, it illustrates again that everybody's clamoring for the transcript. Until then, they make a transcript available, and then they talk about, which I think is very true, the dangerous precedent of allowing that to take place. I'll get back to that in just a minute, but I think we have John back on the line. So, John, what would you like to add to our conversation?
Hi, Kerby. I've been spending the afternoon calling members of Congress, specifically in the House of Representatives, in the judiciary committees. And I was just simply passing on my message to the congressmen and women. And this is what I said. Why are we trying to impeach the president when there has been no investigation, no indictment of Hillary Clinton and her staff of the obvious breaches of her security and her position as reported by the news? And all the Republican offices that I talked to, they were happy to pass it on, and some of the Democratic officers were equally willing, to pass on, a comment from an American citizen. And but some of them snubbed me. As soon as I said Hillary, they dropped me like a hot potato. And I even had, I said, I am an American citizen passing on my opinion to the American system. And they refused to tell the congressman my message. And it was a real eye-opening experience for me as how our system is currently working and how that some of our members of Congress are just getting yes comments instead of every comment from everybody.
Unfortunately, that's true so often. There are just these incredible echo chambers on both sides, by the way. I mean, some people that are Republican only listen to Fox News. Some people Democrat only listen to MSNBC. I understand that. But I always encourage people to read widely, and I also encourage you to hear contrary points of information because it will help you, if nothing else, hone your argument a little bit more. And back to the point that you made about Hillary, yeah, there are going to be some other shoes to drop. We're starting to see that right now with James Comey and a number of others. Haven't covered that much recently, but we'll get back to it. And I think you are raising a very important question. The investigation was pretty much stopped by James Comey, and now he's kind of under investigation. The IG report and a couple of other things that are coming out from the Justice Department are ones that we'll be talking about in the future. So we'll see. But bottom line is that all we see, now that we see the transcript, is that the president, I think unwisely, I might say, suggested that the president of Ukraine look into this. But all he simply said is you might investigate this and whether or not Joe Biden stopped the prosecution. My argument against that, just before we take a break, is that if indeed there was something that could be indicted, wouldn't you think that the incoming president would actually have maybe moved ahead on that? Because one quick way to win over the American president would be to investigate the son of one of his potential rivals. The fact that they did not investigate that means either there wasn't anything there or they were fearful that it might explode and maybe expose other people in the Ukrainian government. So nevertheless, I don't know where President Zelensky is going with this particular investigation, although it's one of those accidents of scheduling that today the President of the United States and the President of Ukraine are meeting with each other, or I guess now have met with each other at the United Nations. And it brings me back to the point I was making just a minute ago. You notice more and more that President Trump doesn't want to do these phone calls, and you can see why. Somebody who wasn't even there in the Situation Room, somebody who heard it secondhand, who now the IG says might actually have a bias towards one of the Democratic candidates that would run against Donald Trump, that though that individual released some of that information and filed what's, quote, a whistleblower report. By the way, it doesn't qualify apparently as one. And so you can see why he'd rather just meet people face to face without anybody in the room, because he just can't trust his intelligence apparatus to keep quiet and not to release confidential information. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that tomorrow in the 1 o'clock hour, or the first hour, we'll actually have Gene Getz with us, and we have been making available his Life Essentials Study Bible. That's one of those benefits that we send to you, one of the gifts we send to you for your gift of $100 a month. And so I thought we will learn a little bit more about this new edition that is coming out. We have access to it right now. It won't be available in the bookstores, I believe, until March of next year. So this is one benefit that comes because of his connection having put together this multimedia study Bible. So we'll be talking with him, but then the second hour will be free, and we'll probably get into a little bit more on impeachment, but a whole lot more on climate change, the climate crisis, and all of the rest. So those are topics we will address tomorrow, and I hope you'll join us for the entire 2 hours. And for those of you that actually are able to hear the third hour that we do, that is another topic that we'll get into as well. One of the articles I've posted here is about Planned Parenthood. And it illustrates, again, one of the themes that runs through Point of View, the need for you to have a level of discernment. Planned Parenthood, actually, according to the director of arts and entertainment at Planned Parenthood, didn't know there was such a place. This particular woman actually has now advised Hollywood on more than 150 productions. Those would be movies and television programs in an effort to influence the abortion dialogue. Now, the reason we know about this, it was published in Daily Caller, but the reason we know about this is the fact that Karen Spruck was actually bragging about this. She said, "No one used to call me. I'd be watching TV and going to the movies and figuring out who I thought might be open to including these storylines. Now I have a couple of repeat clients. Now people call me." You know, you've had some movies, Cider House Rules fits as a good example, that it was almost a pro-abortion movie from its beginning, and certainly launched the careers of a couple of somewhat known actors, but really put them on the map. But I was completely unaware that you have about 150, whether it's television shows or movies, being influenced by Planned Parenthood. So again, what you see, read, and hear, have some discernment. Really important. One of the other articles I've posted is by our friend Victor Davis Hanson, called Our Privileged Scolds. What it is he spends a fair amount of time in a very lengthy article. I'm just going to give you his summary. But he points out that whether you look at Beto O'Rourke, whether you look at Bernie Sanders, whether you look at Elizabeth Warren, or whether you look at Joe Biden, those are kind of the big four he talks about, they tell you that you need to do certain things that they themselves don't do. They complain about certain things that they are guilty of. And so he's come up with, as he ends this long discussion about how they oftentimes talk about the various issues that they're addressing, and these we should be concerned about the wealthy. Recognize virtually every one of those, I think all of them, are millionaires, sometimes multimillionaires, and sometimes have multiple houses and all that. And it's always a little bit funny to me that you have these multimillionaires on both sides of the aisle debating various issues and accusing the other multimillionaire of not understanding what it's like to be poor. I mean, they just live in a world most of us cannot even imagine. So nevertheless, he comes up at the end, that is Victor Davis Hanson comes up with 5 simple commandments that they should follow. Of course, they won't, but if they did follow them, you wouldn't hear a lot from them. Number 1, I will not lecture on the evils of gun ownership if I own a handgun or if anyone in my security detail carries one. Number 2, I pledge not to sermonize on the unfairness of wealth distribution or carbon emission greed if I own more than one home or if any of my homes are larger than 2,500 square feet. Number 3, I will continue to virtue signal about Green Deal. If I continue to virtue signal about Green New Deal, I should say, I promise that from this day forth, I will not fly on a private jet, not own a heated swimming pool or hot tub, nor own or ride in an SUV, nor own or use air conditioning. Number 4, I swear not to rail against the failure of the public schools in general, the evils of non-union and charter schools, and in particular the asymmetries of the quality of our education system if I place my own children in private academies and prep schools, or if I attended a private school myself. And finally, I will cease pontificating about white privilege and white supremacy if I live in a nearly all-white, non-diverse neighborhood and my children have ever attended a wealthy, predominantly white school. In other words, the point is they scold us about all sorts of different things, but the bottom line is they're guilty of it so often. And over the years, we've talked about individuals that have been saying we need to support the public schools. But none of my kids go to the public schools. They go to elite academies. We should downsize what we do so that we reduce our carbon footprint. And I've said before, I'll put my carbon footprint against the carbon footprint of a lot of those individuals that are calling for me to reduce my carbon footprint. And again, even he talks about this idea of white privilege, and of course, even the issue of guns. I'm going to talk about the evil of guns, but recognize that I am actually protected by guns. And so we can see some of those issues are relevant as well. Well, tomorrow we'll probably spend some time talking about the, if you will, children's crusade on this issue of the environment. And one of the things that Ben Shapiro says today is perhaps we should only pay a little bit of attention to some of the young people right now marching on this issue of climate change, because he says we don't expect children to have solutions. After all, they're children. But adults hiding behind children to avoid the difficult conversations that must take place about how to achieve solutions is nothing more than moral cowardice. We're not expecting them to have solutions, but okay, I'm looking for the solutions if indeed we're going to have to address some of these environmental issues. And we need to have something more than just the anger and the finger pointing that is taking place. Rich Lowry, I love, he says, we don't expect teenagers, and we don't go to teenagers for guidance on various public policy issues. He says, with very rare exceptions, kids have nothing interesting to say to us. The one exception he uses is philosopher John Stuart Mill. Okay, he was a child prodigy, and maybe occasionally a teenager has some really smart things to say, but most of the time it doesn't work out quite so well. And then Dennis Prager has even made some comments as well about the fact that what we have today is a desire to get the children out in front. And he says, if you can't sell your hysteria to adults, try kids. And that's what the left has done. After all, no one is as malleable and as easily indoctrinated as children, Dennis Prager says. He said if the left didn't tell them the world is going to an end, they wouldn't worry about it. They'd be enjoying their young lives, maybe even learning to appreciate the fact that we live in the freest country at the most prosperous time in human history. And so just a good illustration of some of the kinds of things that are unfolding right now. We have the climate summit taking place this week in the United Nations, so we'll come back to this issue of climate change and a climate crisis and climate alarmism and all of the rest. And tomorrow I want to share out of the book Falter where some of these ideas have come from. Because when you hear Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez fearful that if the glaciers retreat, that this will release all sorts of pathogens and all sorts of viruses in the environment. Where did that come from? And you have some that are convinced that we already are killing people and eventually we won't even have enough oxygen in the planet. Where does that come from? And a lot of that comes from a book which has then been excerpted and put it in social media. And for the first time, I think I've come to understand a little bit more why so much hysteria and why we need to bring a little bit of common sense into this conversation. So that will take place tomorrow. But just as we come to the end of the program today, if you've enjoyed some of the conversation we've had already and enjoyed Max Lucado, Mat Staver, and others, can I ask you to give us a call even as we go off the air? The pledge line number is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or just simply go to the website, pointofview.net. Your gift of any size would be greatly appreciated. We'll be back here tomorrow.
It is a horrible scenario, but it happens. Dennis writes about his wife who was diagnosed with leukemia. She's now a 2-time survivor. They ran up over $1 million in medical bills. Thankfully, they're Medishare members, and Dennis says they're so thankful for that, how people came together to meet their needs. Medishare works, and it can save you a lot of money. The typical family saves $500 a month. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
Every day we face new challenges. At the time of Jonah, the Bible says in Nineveh, they couldn't tell their right hand from their left. But in America today, a bunch of people can't tell men from women. In fact, some say men can be women. Christians are called to proclaim God's truth in every area of life. But who has time to study every crazy new thing the world can think of? I'm glad you asked. Get the information you need every day with Kerby's Viewpoints commentary. Sign up to receive them via email at pointofview.net/viewpoints or find them on the Point of View radio app. Viewpoints commentaries, making sense of the world around us. pointofview.net/viewpoints. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.